Hey guys, this is Jerry Orrs reporting for Kids First. Right now we have a very special guest. He is Glenn Entis. He has an incredible career ranging from Pacific Data Images, where he created some of the groundbreaking work in animation computing, all the way to EA, where he was Senior Vice President as well as Chief Technical and Visual Officer, and so much more. So Glenn, first I want to talk about the very beginning, Pacific Image Datas.
Pacific Data Images.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So could you talk a little bit about how you got started there and what made you want to get into that? Because it is a very niche field at the time when you started.
Yeah, it was very early. In college, when I went to college, I didn't know if I was going to be a fine arts student or a physics student. I always loved math, was very good in math, but I also loved art. I ended up being a fine arts and philosophy student. Graduated in 1976. All my interest in college was on art and technology and the impact technology was having on art. And I thought, I want to get a job in computer graphics, and realized maybe I should have studied computer programming in college, because that was the only way you could do it then. So I went to graduate school, moved to New York City, went to graduate school in computer science, got a job on Wall Street as a programmer just to learn programming, and started applying to everybody who was doing computer graphics at the time, which wasn't very many people. There was just a few studios doing very, very small jobs, and they all turned me down. The ones who bothered to respond to me turned me down. Then the others didn't even respond to me. And at some point I realized I had gotten a job out in California to work for Hewlett Packard as a software engineer, but I realized if I ever really want to do computer animation, maybe I have to start my own studio. So I met two other friends, Carl Rosendahl and Richard Chung, and together we started PDI. And that's actually turned out to be a really great way to get a job in the field that you want if it's early, is just go out and start the company. And we had to learn a lot of stuff by the seat of our pants. But I will say, and this is one of the lessons that has not, this lesson has never gotten old for me, because I look back and I was lucky that I was so passionately in love with computer graphics and computer animation. I don't know why. I can make guesses, but the fact is I was just wired that way. And I realized at some point that I would be happy, or I wouldn't be happy if I didn't give it a shot. I never actually thought I would succeed. There was just too many odds against us. But I realized if I didn't give it my best shot, I would die feeling unfulfilled. And I'm glad it worked out, but I think it's a good rule of thumb, which is if you find something where you say, I would rather fail at doing this than succeed at anything else, because if I never give this a try, I'll feel like I haven't used my time on earth well, you've probably found your calling. And for me, I was lucky. That was my calling. I wouldn't have been happy doing anything else.
I think that's such a good message to our audience. Make sure you follow your passion above everything else. And Glenn, at the early days of PDI, if you read biographies and descriptions, it says you guys were doing everything, including mopping the floors. Yeah. So what was that early life like? Because you just said passionate about computer animation, computer technology, but you also had to balance it because it was a business. It had to make profits. It had to work with other businesses and manage everything like a normal business. So how did you balance those two fields?
Well, one thing is you don't want to be too good at mopping the floors, because then you'll end up being the go-to guy on that. So you want to be just okay at that. But you really have to, it was a huge learning experience for me to be in a company where, number one, I really cared about the company as well as what I was doing. That was going to be, in a lot of ways, we were putting everything we had into that. I mean, financially, emotionally, time, we put everything we had into that company. But it was also the big education for me was learning how to be responsible for a company. I mean, nobody teaches you that. You don't get experience of that growing up. And I found myself, especially as we started hiring people, I found myself having to take responsibility for helping other people get their work done. As we started to grow, other people's careers, had to be responsible for whether or not I thought myself as a manager, which sort of seemed at the time very pretentious and growing up. It's just like, no, we're just doing computer graphics here. We're animators. But yet we were hiring people. We had to negotiate salaries. We had to think about people's careers, start to think about their career paths and giving them promotions, and all that stuff we had to kind of learn on our own and grow into. And for me, I never would have guessed that it would have been a natural transition. And to say it's natural, I mean, there's always problems. There's always things you have to deal with as you change. And it was hard in a way for me to spend less time doing the thing I really loved, which was making images move on the screen and writing software to make those images move. I loved programming. to more of a management role. But I found it was actually a pretty easy transition in some ways. I cared about the company. I really cared about the people. I like working with people. And at some point, as the company grew and we needed somebody to be the chief operating officer, that role naturally fell to me because I was the one who's paying most attention to operations anyway. Looking back, I never would have guessed that would have been a role that would have fit me. It's just nothing in my early youth. So I think my big takeaway from that again is, if the first lesson is follow your passion, the second lesson is recognize you may not actually know what that passion is, or you may have other things that you will end up being passionate about that you'll only discover by doing. And one thing I would say to your audience is it's great to follow your passion, but you don't always know what that passion is. So just don't wait for your passion. Go out and do stuff. Do stuff that you find gives you energy, is fun, is making a contribution. Follow your passion if you have it, and if you don't have a passion, don't worry about it. Just go out and just start adding fuel into that fire, and you will find things that you're good at. You'll find things that you enjoy doing, and sometimes passion grows. And my passions have changed. My core passion for computer animation has never gone away, but how it's manifested itself and the kinds of things I've done have been very, very different over my career. That's actually one of the things I like about my career is the variety.
You make some great points for our audience. I think those are some really excellent morals that you live by. And after PDI, you went bigger and bigger and bigger, from DreamWorks Interactive, where you're former CEO, to EA. So how did your day-to-day life change as you went from PDI, which was an operation you started yourself, to these large corporations full of people that were there way before you and way after you?
And, there's always the good story and the real story. I mean, the good story was it was great. When I got the call to see if I was interested in being the CEO for DreamWorks Interactive, and it was a cold call, I told my wife, it's like, it's another one of those things where you say, if I don't do this, I'll go to my deathbed feeling like I didn't take advantage of the opportunities that have been given me. My first face-to-face interview was with Steven Spielberg and Jeffrey Katzenberg and some other DreamWorks execs, and it was really amazing to be kind of put into that world. Turns out I felt very comfortable with them. They obviously felt comfortable with me. They hired me for the job. So it was a wonderful opportunity. It was a big transition, but it is really different. At PDI, I knew that company better than anyone. I had the moral authority to speak for the company. And it was a field that I had grown up with, computer animation. Video games is close to computer animation, but it's different. So I was really a relative newcomer in a field, and suddenly leading a very high-profile studio with bosses who expected the absolute best. So it was a fun transition, but it was also a very tough transition. And I'm glad I stayed with it. I think there were days I had my doubts, but it was a great experience. But the chance to work with someone like Steven Spielberg on video games, the chance to work with the kind of talent we were able to attract to that kind of studio, to have the opportunities to get, whether it was licenses or voice talent, or we had a great composer, Michael Giacchino, on some of his first work that he did for entertainment. All of that, because of where we were positioned in the circle of people we were in, was an amazing opportunity. Really, really so happy I was able to do that.
You made a great segue there to video games because, of course, EA and DreamWorks Interactive, they make video games. And something that fascinates me is it is related to computer animation, but it is not exactly related because animation is entertainment and video games is an interactive entertainment. So on the craft side and not the business side, what was it different? What was the day-to-day life? How was it different? How was the experience and skills needed different?
It was very, very different. And it was some of the big differences were the things I was really looking for. I had felt when I moved into video games, I felt like that there was a steeper learning curve and faster progress there than in computer animation. People can argue that point, but there's a lot of even just solid structural technical reasons why that was just on a much steeper slope. And I love that adrenaline. I mean, that was why I got into computer animation graphics in the first place, that excitement of new technology, new possibilities, new creative opportunities. And what I was seeing at PDI was, as PDI was starting to get into visual special effects, it seemed like a promising direction for the company, but it felt like we were going to be at the very tail end of a long chain of decisions. And we weren't necessarily going to have the creative freedom to create the kind of things I wanted to try to create. Whereas with video games, the teams were smaller then. There was a lot more opportunity for creative design to come from within the team rather than from the director through the special effects supervisor. And it actually put a great test of my ability to manage creative teams, because we were responsible for a lot more of the creative design than we had been for a lot of the jobs that we did at PDI. And again, it was any good education is a tough education. It was a great education. And a lot of what I do now as a consultant, I still consult with groups. I still lead workshops and creative seminars for game development teams, animation development teams, sometimes businesses. But a lot of the craft I learned about how do you get a group of people energized to talk about the same things in the same way, have the same momentum for very, very different points of view they're bringing into it, and get the best creative productivity out of a team. I feel like the early lessons, most of those I learned at DreamWorks Interactive.
I think you make a great point. The skills of leadership, of managing, that lasts a long time, and it doesn't really matter the field because it is managing people. It is, yeah. So we talked about today. In the future, what projects are you working on in the future that you can talk about now?
Well, something I'm very excited about. I don't think I can give all the details about it, but I've done a lot of things in my career. I've never been a curator of a major museum show, which is what I'm doing now. I'm a co-curator on a show that is going to be very technological in its focus, but it is going to be a major museum show. There's a lot that I'm going to learn in that. Fortunately, I am the co-curator, which is different than my curating partner, who was the lead curator. So that person's got the heavy, they're doing the heavy lifting of actually all the logistics and putting the show together. But this is relatively new for me. It is a blast. It is, I'm mostly retired now, so I've always worked for fun, but now I can afford to work only for fun. It doesn't really have to be, museums usually don't have stock options, and big compensation plans. That's okay. I'm doing it just for the sheer joy of it. It's involving artificial intelligence and visual culture, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, I am actually interested in that because these interviews are edited using artificial intelligence technology in the audio and in the video. So,
oh, you don't have an editor. You just punch a button?
That would be nice.
Yeah.
That would be very, very nice. Not quite yet, maybe in 10 years. But sadly, that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much for talking to me about your career and your experience. Before we go, I have one more question. You talked a lot about lessons for kids who are watching. Do you have any other tips for people who want to get into this industry or get into the computer science industry like you did?
Aside from being clear yourself of what you're really interested in, or if you aren't clear, just going out and trying stuff. The other thing the advice I'll always give to anybody starting out is figure out ways where you can be unreasonably well prepared for the things you want to do and the people you want to talk to. Jerry, you're a good example of this. You clearly do your homework for this. And that is a really good example for what I'm talking about, is that if you're going to, it doesn't even have to be a job interview, if you're going to talk to somebody who's in a field, not only do your homework on them, what they've done, what their background is, the kinds of questions you can ask that person, but figure, where does that person get their information? You don't have to read technical papers in detail and understand all the math, but it's useful to go online if it's a technical area and see what are the technical papers that currently matter, and just scan through the titles, look through the illustrations and the pictures, get a sense of what the conversation is in the field that you're interested in. And the more work you do in that, and you can do all that online, or you can go to conferences if they're near you, like the annual SIGGRAPH conference is a great one for computer graphics research. The more you feel like I'm putting an unreasonable amount of time into this, the better you're doing. Because what you want to do is not only be prepared and have a good personal Geiger counter of where the interesting stuff is, but you also want, if you're making contacts with people, you want them to come away impressed and say, I didn't have to go over any of the remedial stuff with this person. This person's doing that on their own. They're actually asking me great questions. This person is already off the starting block. That is really important. And you'll be amazed at how many doors it will open with people who feel like if you're willing to do that much of the work on your own, I'm definitely willing to put some energy and help you get to the next step.
That is such a good point. That is such a good moral. I hope our audience has taken notes. Thank you, Glenn, so much for talking to me about your career, about your life, and about those amazing lessons. For our audience, Kids First has so many amazing interviews with amazing people just like Glenn, so be sure to check it out and also to check out his past work as well as his upcoming exciting work. Stay tuned for that. I'm your host, Jerry Orr, signing off. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.